I'm Kim Pepper. I'm the co-founder and technical director of Previous Next, and long-time core contributor. So I've been working on Drupal core for, probably the last couple of years. That's not a long time, but in Drupal 8 land, it is pretty long, I suppose. So I actually don't usually spend a lot of time on site building tasks. I spend most of the time doing core development work, in my spare time, and that's pretty low level. And I actually gave a talk on that at DrupalCon Austin, which is more tailored towards developers. But this talk's actually targeted at site builders. So what do I mean by that? So site builders, I think, are the reason why, or site building is the reason why Drupal, I think, is so popular, because essentially there's so many tools that you can use out of the box that are all through the UI. You can point and click and drag and drop and create a site basically with a very rich set of tools. There's not that many products that give that much power out of the box. And so what I wanted to do today was, instead of necessarily focusing on developer improvements, but actually look at what are the site building improvements in Drupal 8. So just out of interest, who is a Drupal site, or who would associate themselves with doing some sort of Drupal site building tasks here? Who's Drupal 7, Drupal 6, doesn't matter. So a lot of you. So, and who has actually downloaded Drupal 8 and take it for a spin and seen what the changes are? Okay, so about 20% of you. Cool. So hopefully, for most of you, I'll be able to give you a bit of a broad overview of what a lot of the site building improvements are. I'm not going to be able to cover everything because there's quite a lot of stuff in there, but I've tried to pick out the kind of things that I think are interesting and useful, and hopefully you'll find them useful as well. So, let me just get my slide. If I can click on my slide. Come on, mouse. All right. So the first thing is, what's wrong with Drupal 7, right? So if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So I think one of the things I picked up when spending time with Drupal 8 was there's a lot of things that I didn't actually realize there were limitations there. I think you kind of are used to sort of spending your time working with the workaround modules or the contrib modules that'll let you get around some of the core limitations. And a lot of you would have noticed, if you were around when Drupal 6 was around and you moved to Drupal 7, there was this kind of like, oh, wow, like the power of, say, just having entities and fields in core, the ability to, build distributions like CRMs and commerce platforms was all really opened up by the underlying sort of technical architecture improvements that came out in Drupal 7. So, yeah, I think that was the kind of key motivation for this talk, is basically like looking at where the improvements are and what kind of things that we were working with in Drupal 7 that we don't have to anymore in Drupal 8. So, so is it worth the upgrade? So, like I said before, there are a huge number of architectural changes under the hood. There's a number of site building improvements, and there's a lot of contrib modules that you don't actually need to use that you just get out of the box. So this is just some of the things. So there's a new configuration management API in Drupal 8. So if you're used to working with features and trying to manage releases of code into multiple staged environments, it's kind of tricky. Features tries to work around that, but there's no inbuilt support in Drupal for doing that. There's a huge amount of contrib modules in core. There's big improvements to blocks. We've got things like CKEditor now, new field types. We've got display and form modes. So if you're used to working with view modes, you've got essentially form modes now as well. There's some built-in responsive support and massive improvements in multilingual in Drupal 8. And of course, a lot more. So these are just a few of the kind of redundant modules that you don't actually need that were previously in contrib. So views is obviously a big one. Who knew that views was in Drupal 8 core? Yeah, quite a few of you. Obviously, it's one of the top contrib modules. It was one of the first sort of parallel initiatives in Drupal 8 to get views into core. It wasn't one of the initial key initiatives. It was just a bunch of views. Maintainers were like, let's get views into core, and it was actually one of the quickest implementations to get through, just because it was kind of pretty well designed from the beginning. But we've also got things like views bulk operations now in Drupal core, which also powers things like admin views, which give you much more powerful content management screens for things like managing lists of content and comments and files and those kinds of things. If you've ever wanted to create blocks with fields on them, you've probably heard of the bean module before, which essentially tries to get around the workaround without having to build kind of custom code. You don't need to use that anymore. There's a WYSIWYG editor now in core. You don't need to use that. And then there's a bunch of modules like link, date, email fields, phone fields, and the list goes on. UUID. Probably more of the lower level development contrib modules like Entity API, which essentially were workarounds around core's sort of half-finished Entity API in Drupal 7. Pretty much any module that was working with entities would always have to use the Entity API module. That is, obviously, there's been huge amounts of development under the hood to actually make that work now in Drupal 8. Even things like Entity Cache, which is a simple caching layer for your entities, is now part of Drupal core. Entity references, so if you ever want to reference one content type to another or reference a user from a content type, that's baked into Drupal 8 core. And I mentioned other tools like entity view modes. So I'll go into some of this in a bit more detail, but if you were, previously, if you wanted to use view modes and have your own custom view modes for content, you'd have to write code to do that. And of course, there's a couple more here which I've kind of asterisked because they're not quite there yet, but they're interesting. Things like menu block and web form. I think you're probably unlikely to need contrib modules to be able to use those features. So views is obviously the big one. I think, this is a pretty familiar screen for those of you using views in Drupal 7. But I think the key thing I wanted to point out is that views is actually now being used for a lot of the core administration screens. So if you want a list of content, that's actually a view now. If you want a list of users, that's a view. Just the standard Drupal front page is a view. And despite sort of the kind of underlying technical change, what that means is that it just opens up the possibility of you being able to customize that, to be able to go in and just click around the view. If you want to add an extra column in your content screen, in your content listing screen, it's just using the views interface to be able to do that. So it's a huge improvement, I think, over what you got out of the box in Drupal 7. And of course, one of the big underlying things that views used was taking advantage of new plugin APIs that have been developed in Drupal 8. So a lot of the changes that you'll see here are because of these core architectural changes under the hood that all of these different modules that we're going to talk about are using underneath. So views actually was using CTools plugins in Drupal 7. In Drupal 8, there's a core plugin API, but the speed at which sort of views was able to be ported across was because of the fact that it was already in that kind of plugin architecture. So WYSIWYG. So, it's a pretty basic WYSIWYG editor. But the fact is now Drupal has never shipped with a WYSIWYG editor in core until Drupal 8. And you might kind of be saying, oh, so what? You just download your WYSIWYG editor and turn it on and it's a contrib and that's great. I think the real benefits are the fact that it's actually more tightly integrated with Drupal in terms of the buttons that you can choose and those kinds of things. They are basically plugins, like I mentioned before. So there's an API around adding additional functionality to the WYSIWYG editor. So the kind of image editor that's there at the moment is pretty basic. You just have to, you add a URL and you can kind of load an image in that way. But the complexity, if anyone worked with the media module in Drupal 7, yeah, okay, so it's obviously hugely complex beast, right? And the reason is it's trying to do a lot. It's doing lots of different things. And one of the key benefits of having things like a WYSIWYG editor in core is that there's a standard API. So things like media module are going to be a lot easier to actually implement using the Drupal 8 APIs. So you're talking about writing plugins and splitting that stuff out. And there's actually a bit of work going on now that some of the guys are working on to improve that integration. So yeah, that's just the snapshot of the insert image thing. So it's pretty basic. One of the key things I think is one of the big improvements is the changes to blocks. So essentially blocks are full entities now in Drupal 8. And what that means is that they're fieldable. So we all know entities are fieldable, right? I don't know if we all do, but entities are fieldable. And what that means is that you can actually add things like images to your blocks. You can add additional text fields. You can add link fields. You can add whatever you want to a block. And you're able to then reuse that. And it's basically trying to create some structure around those blocks without having to write code. So they're fieldable. The other thing is you can actually create multiple instances of blocks. So who's ever created a block and you want to put it in one region and then on a different layout you actually want to put it in a new region? You can't, right? There's only one instance of a block in Drupal 7. And there were modules like multi-block that kind of tried to work around that. In Drupal 8, the model changed. So essentially you have a block type and then you can create an instance of that and assign it to a region. So you can have multiple instances of a block, which is, I think, a big improvement for site builders. I mentioned the configuration management system. All of the blocks config is exportable, which means that you can deploy that configuration. And it's using an underlying conditions plugins API. And I'll explain that when I get to that screen. So firstly, like this is the block layout screen. So you can see most of the screen looks familiar, except you've got on the right-hand side the ability to create a new instance of a block. So these are essentially your block types that are being exposed by whatever module. And then you just click Add, and you want to add a new block. And you can basically, this is essentially what was on the previously Create New Block screen. Okay? And the part down the bottom here is interesting as well, because essentially that's using, instead of some custom code in there to kind of work out how your visibility settings work, it's using a new API, which is again based on plugins, called the Conditions Plugins API, and that's essentially an extensible plugin system. So you could come along and write your own plugin and say, okay, I want to add a new way to filter blocks on a screen. And actually the rules module's already written a whole bunch of these in its Drupal 8 version. And then essentially you're able to extend how you filter and place blocks within your site. And the other benefit to that is that contrib modules such as panels or whatever comes along after panels is essentially able to work with the same plugins, right? So it's able to use these conditions at a meta level, at a page level or region level, and they're able to reuse and leverage all of that. And of course, you're able to create your own custom block types now within core. So there's just a basic block to begin with, but then you could either add fields to that, or you can create your own block types. So, I mean, in the past in Drupal 7, you might have done workarounds like, okay, I'm going to create a content type for this, and then I'm going to expose that as a block. And there was lots of workarounds. It's actually now just all baked into core. Cool. So I'm just going to talk about some of the new field types. So this is just, I guess, part of the mobile initiative was really to try and enhance the experience for mobile users. So we needed some more semantically meaningful field types around that, so they could actually be exposed to users on mobile devices. So things like a link field, date field, email field, phone field, and entity references I mentioned before. Basically means that when you're entering content on a mobile device, sorry, that's a bit too small, that screen. But what it's supposed to show, if you can't see it, is that essentially we've got different selectors. So on your phone, if you're entering, say, a date field, you'd get the browser's date selection tool. You don't have to build a JavaScript library for date selection. It just knows it's a date field. And the same goes for, say, if you're entering a URL, then you, by default, you'll get like the .com button and the www button there. If you're doing an email, you'll get the @ symbol. So it's just an improvement, user experience improvement. So comments, another massive improvement. I mean, people probably have just accepted that comments are always attached to nodes. One of the big things that has happened in Drupal 8, and this is thanks to Lee Rowlands, who works with us at Previous Next. He spent months and months trying to get this patch in. Essentially what it means is that you're able to attach comments to any type of entity. So the possibilities are there to make, say, a public and a private thread. So you could have like public comments on an article, and you could have administrator-only comments as well. You're able to separate those two because you have multiple instances of a comment field on there. You're able to add them to things like user profiles or any of the kind of custom entities that you might want to create. So if you're building, say, the Drupal Commerce framework, for example, you might want to attach your comments to a particular order or an account, those kinds of things. That's all possible now because it's just baked into core. And of course, you're able to create different comment types. So comments are entities now in Drupal 8, which means that they're fieldable. And what that means is that I could come along, and if I want to be able to allow users to add an image to their comment or a link to their comment, I can just do it through the standard manage field screens. And I'm able to create multiple types of comments and then assign that type to particular entity, like an article, for example. So if I go to my article, now the comment settings, remember that in Drupal 7, the comment settings were just in your node settings screen. You're able to come in and say, okay, we're going to add a comment field, and then I can configure it from there. So all the settings are now a part of the field API. But you still get the standard kind of comment configuration screens. It's just now underneath the field settings screen. View mode's actually already in Drupal 7, and most people are probably familiar with view modes. Yeah. So they're a good way of trying to encapsulate just how, some configuration for how an entity might be viewed, and then you can reuse that in views, or you can use it wherever you want. One of the big improvements, I think, is the fact that now I've added form modes, which is the configuration of the input of that information. And I'll show you an example in a sec. But first of all, just the fact that now you've got an administration screen for all your view modes. So instead of having to write, hook, blah, 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 alter, blah, blah, blah in code, you can just go and manage them through a UI. So you can go and add new view modes for any of the entities that you've got in your application or your site. And then form modes are kind of really powerful. And I think the simple example that ships with Drupal core is the user registration field. So the example would be, all right, I want to capture all of this information in a user profile, but when a user signs up, I don't want them to be bamboozled by options. I just want them to just go, give me your email address and a password, because I want it to lower the barriers to entry, get them in. But then later on, I want to have the ability for them to add all of this information. So all you need to do is create a form display mode. And you might create one called register, and then you just drag and drop which fields actually appear in that, and then that becomes the registration field. So that's something you could do with any entity type. You can create multiple ways of entering the information, and it might be depending on which way they're coming in and adding that content. So this would be an example. You can actually go and configure that. So that's once you're looking at the register, the view mode. Another often overlooked feature of Drupal 7 was the contact form. It's now a fieldable entity, right? So the contact form itself, you can attach fields to. You can previously, if you wanted to make changes to the contact form, like, oh, do we need to add a link field in there as well? That would be code. That would be hook form alter blah de blah, and then you'd have to handle that yourself. Because it's an entity, you just go through the same manage form fields, like so, and then you're able to create multiple contact forms. So the reason I think this might be a web form replacement is basically, for most simple uses of web form, we're essentially building a survey, like it's some sort of, please register your interest in this and we'll sign you up. Because now you can do that quite easily through UI, that's going to solve most of those use cases. At the moment in core, it doesn't store the results of the web form. Just sends an email like the standard functionality is, but it already supports form storage. So there is already a test. There's already tests in Drupal 8 core that prove that the storage, you just add a storage backend to the contact form entity and it will save that for you. So there is a contrib module out there already that's doing that. So I think that will be a big game changer. And because it's an entity, you automatically get things like views support. Right? So you can build your report form where you say, show me the list of all the form submissions. You can do, because you've got views, you can export it as CSV or do whatever you want. Essentially, you've got a pretty powerful tool there. Yeah, I won't talk about this too much, just because it's not necessarily, it's probably more of a theming discussion, but there is good responsive support in Drupal core now. And the main thing, I think, is probably the responsive image option. So basically what that means is you can set up breakpoints. Who's heard of the picture module and responsive? Okay. So the picture module is a spec to be able to handle images of different size images at different browser widths. So if you're on a mobile, you don't want to be loading a large desktop image. And so what the picture module does is say, it uses the browser width and says, okay, I'm on a narrow screen, load the small image. So the idea is that the page is actually loading a lot faster. There's not unnecessary bandwidth being used. And that's actually still a draft spec, I think. I don't think it made it through. I know that Chrome Canaries had picture module, like the beta version of Chrome is, I think, got it in, or it might even be stable now, I'm not sure. It's not, I don't think it's widely supported by browsers, but Drupal core is using a JavaScript shim that basically gives support for the picture module in browsers that don't natively support it. So what that means is that you can set up, just using your standard image styles that you would use in Drupal 7, create different image styles based off the browser dimensions and say, okay, for mobile I want to use a smaller image, and it will do all the automatic resizing and what Drupal does already, and then work with a series of breakpoints. So when I get to certain browser width, then load the next one. If I get to a bigger one, then load the larger image. Unfortunately, there's no real UI in Drupal 8 core for the breakpoints module at the moment. It's all done through kind of YAML files, configuration files. I think there's still more work being done on it still, like to make it easier to add them into your theme settings, but it's a work in progress. Okay, so the big change, I think, if anyone's felt pain with features module before, is essentially the configuration management system. So you don't need features anymore. You don't really need CTools exportables anymore. You don't need the variable module anymore. You probably don't need hook update n anymore, because we've got essentially a unified configuration API, and that is across all features in Drupal. So previously, the reason why the features module, people had so many headaches with it, is because it's really just trying to cover over all the bumps of what exists with core and contributed modules. Like the way that content types and fields works is different to the way that image styles works, and it's trying to accommodate for all of the kind of different modules, and some of them just don't support it that well. In Drupal 8, essentially, everyone's using the same API, so it's actually much simpler task to actually generate configuration or import or export configuration. So there's a couple of simple tools built into Drupal 8. So you can do like a single import and export of a particular piece of configuration, and each module will define what configuration it supports. So you can do a simple import and export, or you can do pretty much like a full, give me the whole site configuration. So depending on your workflow, you're going to be able to handle that a lot more easily. I think what features was originally problem it was trying to solve was to try to package things up in kind of groups around a feature, right? So for a blog feature, you would want to include the content types and what fields it has, plus maybe the views that it was being displayed in, plus maybe the image styles that it used. And you wanted to kind of contain that because it was one feature that all these configuration things belong together. The Drupal core configuration system doesn't try to do that at all. It's pretty much like, I'll dump the whole configuration and I'll slip it all up again, but I'm not going to try and allow you to group things together. So really depending on what your individual workflow of deployment is, I think this sort of stuff will evolve once Drupal 8 is actually out and people are using it and sort of find the best way to do things. I do know that there is people working actively at the moment on contrib modules that allow you to do what features does and be able to create groups of configuration. I think it's called the configuration development module, which CHX has been working on, amongst others. And that seems to be getting a bit of momentum. But I mean, a typical configuration deployment workflow at the moment, this is the kind of trivial case would be, who uses Drush? Does everyone use Drush? About half of you, okay. So this would be for those who familiar with the command line, this is just going to be a simple way of doing this without having to click around. So you'd basically can use a Drush, you'd set up a config staging directory, which is basically where you're going to dump your config to, and you would typically check that into Git, for example, if you're using version control. You can use a drush command that's built into the latest version of Drush just to export it all. You commit that and then you push it, and then when you're on your server, you use the same kind of drush command to import it, and you specify which, from the staging, and that's it. So that's the kind of workflow for pushing configuration from your development to a staging and thereon. All right. So another massive improvement, I think, is multilingual, and I think people who are from sort of non-English speaking countries are most enthusiastic about this. But I'll just give you a brief overview of what's changed, and you can pull me up if there's things I've missed here because it's not really my strong area. But essentially, there's lots of workarounds in Drupal 7 to make configuration kind of just work. The actual core content translation module was a little bit crufty in the way it worked. It kind of created you'd say, oh, okay, I want a translation of this node. It would go and create a separate node and then just try to link them together. But there was the entity translation module, which tried to work with fields, which is the way that Drupal 8 has gone. So it's trying to just use the field configuration to say, okay, for this language, when this field is shown, use this version. It's a lot more powerful, I think, that way. So there's heaps of modules that you actually need to use in order to make your site multilingual in Drupal 7. And this is just some of the ones I could think of. Even things like titles, right? Like a node title isn't translatable even if you're using the entity translation module, because in Drupal 7, a title isn't actually a field. It's actually what's called a base field. So it's part of the node table. You don't actually have any field configuration for it. So yeah, I mean, these modules that you would probably have to put, used in order to make the site multilingual. So in Drupal 8, like I said, we're using entities. Entities are translatable. Configuration is translatable. Even the installer is translatable. And it actually, I've heard people like Gabor say that the core Drupal multilingual support is much more powerful than all of the kind of contrib modules in Drupal 7 plus core and Drupal 7 combined, just because it's much more deeply ingrained in the system. So these are just the modules that you get out of the box in Drupal 8. And as you can see, it's handling configuration. So previously, if multilingual in Drupal 7, you would be overriding variable names and string overrides and those kinds of things. In Drupal, in part of the APIs, the configuration management API is to allow all of the configuration to expose what the configuration settings are, and then allow them to be translatable, right? So this is kind of like meta schema thing around your configuration that says, this is all the things that I'm defining in configuration, and that exposes it to the translation system to be able to go, oh, I could provide translations for these. Yeah, so there's a lot there. Even the installer. So if you go and choose by default, if you went and chose a different language in the installer, you can now install Drupal with a different language, and it won't even install English as default. It used to just always have English there. It doesn't even have to have it there. So yeah, some pretty powerful stuff. So what's in the future? So I mentioned some of these before, but I'll just give you a brief update on some of those common modules that you probably use in Drupal 7 all the time. So the good news is things like menu block is likely to get into core since I finished writing the test, because that's what it's waiting for at the moment. It's actually working. So the core menu system has been completely kind of re-architected, and the APIs are so much better now to actually do what menu block is trying to do. If you ever looked at the code for menu block, it was pretty crazy. It's like, a couple of lines of code now to achieve what menu block is doing in Drupal 8. So that's, I'm 95% confident that you won't need the menu block module in Drupal 8. I think it'll just be there out of the box. All of the main navigation are going to be replaced with using that, and you'll have the power there to be able to have those kind of submenus as blocks. Display Suite is sort of, depends on what you use Display Suite for, but if you use Display Suite to be able to provide that tool to be able to create new view modes, you probably don't need to use it anymore. There's probably, I was really trying to contact some of the maintainers just to say what's going on with Display Suite. I know they've got like an alpha release out there, so they are still working on it, but what direction they're going, I'm not sure. So Page Manager's making a lot of improvements. So it's basically, remember I showed you the block screen before and all the conditions. So that's what Page Manager is using. It's using like theme variants for the page. So that's actually looking good. It's being maintained by Tim Plunkett, who's one of the top contributors. So it's definitely got the right people behind it. And Panels, I see, is building on top of Page Manager. So they already started building a panels for Drupal 8 and building it on top of Tim's work on Page Manager, which is good. Unfortunately, things like a UI for token module didn't get into Drupal 8, so there's still a contrib module for token, and that's still pretty crufty. It's getting worked on still, and that we're actually a few of us at Previous Next are still working on that to get a Drupal 8 release, as well as Path Auto. So that's something I've been looking at, and that's working now. Path Auto is working, but it's not really. It's still not using things like the plugin API. So that's part of a big push that we're going to be doing in the next few weeks to try and get that a lot nicer. Meta tags hasn't started yet, just if you're interested. So I was contacting Dave Reed, who's the maintainer of meta tags, and he's like, I'm waiting till the beta release comes out before I even look at it. So, yeah. Who remembers meta tags quick?
Oh, yeah. But that was a big blocker for 7, right? I mean, that was one of the big things.
Yeah.
Holding you back.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the thing is that not one person controls this stuff. I mean, if you're interested in meta tags, it's going to be important for you. That's a big module, but get in there and start contributing, and hopefully we get it up.
Reservation, perhaps that too much is still changing.
Yeah, that would be his main reservation. I don't know how much of the stuff that is related to meta tags is changing. Yeah, most of that stuff is stable.
Fairly stable.
Yeah.
He maintains like 50 other modules.
Yeah. He's spread thin. And I mentioned before, so features, there's the configuration development module. So if you're interested in seeing what the future of features is going to be, I'd probably try and stick with the default configuration APIs until you kind of you're actually building Drupal 8 websites and going, oh, okay, well, I actually really need to isolate some of this configuration and organize it, because I think in the meantime, before Drupal 8 comes out, those tools will develop. And I mentioned web forms before. So web forms, I believe that it'll be basically the core contact forms module, and we'll just be able to plug in like a storage. Yes, Donna? Yeah. Possibly.
Well, you wouldn't use entity form, you'd use the contact form for
But Donna's right. So what entity forms uses is the Drupal core fields way of adding things, right? So yeah, it's essentially the same as entity form. But yeah. So when can we get it? I don't know. So all I can say is basically there's 2 beta blockers left, I think, at the moment. So the beta blocker, I believe there'll be, once the 2 beta blockers are in, which should be the next couple of weeks, there'll be one more alpha release, I think, and then the first beta release. So that's pretty significant if you're considering using or it's starting to look at, not building sites on Drupal 8, but if you're looking at what contrib modules are out there, because pretty much once the beta comes out, it's like real code freeze, right? So basically, we heard about code freeze. It's like, this is a real code freeze. So yeah, just basically a lot of people waiting on that beta release. So I'm pretty confident that'll be pretty soon. And the other big thing that people aren't aware is that Drupal's moved to this, the releases of Drupal are now what's called semantic versioning. So that means that you've got instead of like an 8.15, you'll have an 8.0.15. And semantic versioning, if people aren't familiar, means that last kind of number is just bug fixes on that. And we can increment to an 8.1, which adds new features and new APIs without breaking backwards compatibility. So what we're going to see is a much more rapid release cycle. So we may see Drupal core releases, major core releases, so an 8.1 and 8.2, every 6 months to every year from now on. So we won't be waiting 4 years to get new features. So if someone comes along and goes, you know what, I'm going to rewrite how the menu tree system works. That could actually be in an 8.1, but they'd keep the old one in there as well, but the new version would actually use the new one. So, yeah, so that's pretty exciting. Questions? Anyone got any questions? I tried to talk fast to get through all of that, but... No? Cool. Oh.
Come on, mate. That's what I'm doing questions. First off, good stuff on the comments. That's a really big improvement. So well done to you guys for doing that. You mentioned the menu system being rewritten. Is that going to sort of have views support? And can you kind of hook into that to kind of query child items? That's a very specific question, I know. But
I don't know. I don't know. I think I sort of was following that a bit. That they got it's. So menu links are kind of a funny thing, right? Because sometimes you want to define a menu link as hard-coded. You've got it in your module and it's like, that's the link, it doesn't change. But other times you create a new menu link through the UI and it's kind of like, hey, here's a new link. So there's different types of menu links, and the big refactoring that went on was turning that all into the plugin system. So there's different ways of creating menu links by using this kind of menu link plugin manager. I don't claim to understand it, but the underlying storage of menu link storage is still using the old Drupal 7 tree structure where it's pretty, people kind of scratch their head and look at that.
Still limited to 9 levels?
Yeah.
Oh.
But like I said before, like it could easily happen in 8.1 where it's like, you know what, I've just written a new menu tree storage implementation. Let's use that one instead, and that's entirely possible.
So I guess what they did with the menu is that they decoupled the access checks and the menu structure. So you still have the old hood to define menu links, but it doesn't do any like permission checking. You need to define that in megabyte file and use the routing.
The routing defines the. Yeah, I mean, I didn't really go into the new routing system and stuff. That's a bigger topic. Awesome. Thank you.